In this video, I'm going to show you how to update an old door. This is what the doors look like before, and this is what they look like now. This applies to wood doors with a finish on it, or a modern 6-panel painted door like this. In this tutorial, I'm using some sawhorses with a blanket, a putty knife, a sanding sponge, and a drill if you are going to change out the door hardware. Paint tray with a liner, a paint roller with a roller cover. The paint roller needs to have the shortest snap possible to get the smallest texture. I'm using a 1/4 inch, which is typically the smallest you could buy. A nylon or nylon polyester blend paintbrush. Also not required but gives a better finish is using this Floetrol by Flood. Some spackling or wood filler. A palm sander with a medium to fine grit sandpaper. The first step is to remove the door from the frame. You could either remove it at the wall, the door, or just take out the hinge. What I'm going to do is take it out the hinge because in my experience it was easier to do it this way. To do this, all I have is a flat screwdriver and a hammer. I'm just going to put this under the head right here, lightly hammer it until it comes out. Before you completely remove it, I'm going to do the other one as well. The bottom hinge had a heavy layer of coating on it, so I couldn't get the flathead screwdriver under the head. So what I'm going to do is come from the bottom. There's a hole in there. All I have is a nail. I'm just going to stick it through the hole. It's going to hit the bottom of the top pin. I'm just going to hammer it through like this. Now that the bottom is fully out, I'm going to fully remove the top one. To do this, I'm going to hold the door by the handle and just wiggle this until it comes out. Once both pins are removed, you can just remove the door like this. It'll just fall out. Here I have 2 sawhorses set up. I would suggest putting a blanket down on top of this so you don't damage the surface of the door. At this point, I'm going to remove the brackets right here. Here, I'm also going to remove the doorknob. You could have removed the doorknob before removing the door. I'm just going to do it now because it was easier for me. To remove the doorknob, there are just 2 screws typically on each side. They're past the plane of the doorknob, so you have to go in at an angle like this. That's why I like to use a very long screwdriver. Once you've completely removed the screws, you can just pull this out, and the bottom part comes out as well. This typically has a little bracket with 2 screws. You would remove that, then this would just pull out. In this case, this is a very old door, so this is just press fit in here. So I have to get a screwdriver or something and wedge this out. Here's how it typically is. You just remove these 2 screws, and then this will slide out once you remove this little faceplate. What I'm going to do is stick the screwdriver at the end of it and see if I just slightly tap it out without damaging the wood. Now I'm going to get a degreaser and completely clean the entire door. It's very dirty around the handle. You might not be able to see it, but there's a layer of grease from your hands touching it. In order for the paint to stick correctly after you sand it, this needs to be completely clean. So make sure and do a thorough job. Make sure and get on the edges as well. You don't have to worry about the top or bottom of the door since you probably won't be painting those anyways. Next, I'm going to repair any damage that might be in the door. So I'm going to first start out by scuffing it up. Make sure any filler that you use will stick to it. So I have just a sanding sponge. Then either using spackling or wood filler, I'm just going to fill these up. Spackling is a little thicker, and since these are hollow, it'll fall through if I use the filler. So I'm just going to use the spackling. Then just let this dry. Next, it's time to scuff the previous paint or finish. So I have 120 grit sandpaper on my sander. What I do is work in sections. So I'm going to make it in roughly a 1/6 of the area of the door. So I'm going to start at one end, slowly move it like this until I reach the end of my section. Move down. I'm only overlapping the previous pass by around 50%. Then I'm going to do another pass like this and continually go back and forth. Once I reach the end, I'm going to do the exact same thing and move the other way back to the starting point. Then I'm going to do all the other sections, flip the door, and then do the other side. For the ends of the door, you could use a sanding sponge. Just move in random motions. It's very important that you get good scuffing right here or the paint won't stick correctly. The paint will brush off as soon as it touches the door frame. For the end of the door, you could also brush off quickly. This is more so just to get the dust off so you don't get dirt in your paint later on. If you have panel doors, this is where the sanding sponge comes in handy. Just stick it in here like this and sand away. Be very careful on the corners because you might sand through completely, but using a sponge versus plain sandpaper in your hand will reduce the chances of you wearing it through. Again, if your doors are in fairly good shape, the point is not to actually level any surface, it's just to scuff the existing paint or finish. You don't want to go too deep or you could create gouges and then you're going to have to sand the entire door again to make it level. Just the weight of the sander is enough. Everything is sanded, it's best to either blow it off with compressed air if you're outside, or you could use a vacuum cleaner. It's important that you get rid of all the dust particles. The next step is to paint the doors. I would strongly recommend doing this in a garage or a shop area. If you do it outside, contaminants like pollen, dirt, and little bugs will immediately be attracted to this and you'll end up with a horrible finish. So open up the paint can. Thoroughly mix it up with either a stir stick or you could put a mixer on a drill and stir it. At this point, I would strongly recommend using the Floetrol, so add it to the paint can now. You only need to mix about 8 ounces for the full gallon of paint. Now it's time to apply the paint. I would suggest using the roller for most of it. If you have panel doors for the inside panels, it's best to use a paintbrush. I'm going to demonstrate rolling it first. Load up your roller. Then come to the workpiece and roll it along. You want to apply it very heavy. I'm only going to go about that far before I load up again. Be very careful at the edges so you don't roll over them. If you roll over and this is dirty on the ends, you'll get a bunch of dirt in your roller. So I kind of lay off and lift up at the very ends. I'll load up again. What I like to do is drop the paint down first in a big area, then go back to where I started and continue to roll it. Now just continue to do this for the rest of the door. Now once you have a thick coating on the door, I want to start at one end of the door and run the roller continuously across to the other side, and then go back to the beginning, overlap slightly, do the same thing, and do this until you get to the edge of the door. This will give a uniform appearance with the roller. Also, I'm not pressing down on the roller, I'm just allowing the weight of the roller itself. Now just let this completely dry. I would suggest running a fan on it so it dries correctly. If not, it'll be soft for a long time. While you're waiting for the paint to dry, you can just put your roller and your pan in a trash bag, completely seal it. That way it won't dry out. Once the first layer of paint has completely dried and is no longer soft to the touch, you can put on subsequent layers. However, every time you put on a new coat of paint, it needs to be very heavy, otherwise it won't fan out correctly and there will be a texture. Here's an example of the texture if it's not applied heavy enough. The coat is so light that it maintains the exact same texture as it was applied when wet. This is why it needs to be applied heavy even if it's the very last coat. Here's an example of how heavy I'm actually putting it on. It's so heavy that each of these ridges will weigh itself down and flatten out as it dries. Once the first side is done, flip the door over. And this is where having a blanket is very helpful. If you put it on a hard surface like this will stick to the fresh paint on the other side, and when you go to remove it, it'll peel up the paint. After you flip the door over, this is where I would suggest painting the edges. To do this, your roller needs to be fairly dry. So I just loaded this up with paint, so I'm gonna have to rub some off on the door. Now that it's fairly dry, it'll be able to grip much better. If it's still too wet, when you go to try to roll it, it'll just slide. So what I do is put the door past the edge of the sawhorses and just start slowly applying pressure and try to get it to start spinning. What I do is have it moving and then touch it, and it's more likely to start spinning. You have to keep it fairly light for the first coat because it's very slippery. Chances are after you rolled it, paint is on the other side right here on this edge, just like it's on this edge here. This is because as you press in, the nap grabs around the door and overlaps it and gets paint on the other side. So to make sure it doesn't dry very thick, I'm just gonna very light touch it. I'm gonna put the roller at an angle and just roll across like this. It doesn't have to actually roll, you're just getting the excess paint off. Now right after painting the edges, I'm gonna put a coat of paint on this side as well. Now just let the edges and the face of the door dry. Now I'm going to go over how to paint doors with a paintbrush. If you are dead set on using a paintbrush, I would suggest getting the widest one possible. Better start off with, heavily load your paintbrush. You want to get as much paint in the bristles as possible. You could even pour the paint straight onto the door and then spread it around. And just lay down a heavy layer of paint. I decided to test just pouring the paint straight onto the door to see how fast it is. I'm going to start in the middle and just run a line of paint. Now I'm just going to spread it around. I'm going to start on the door and just brush over like this. That way I don't get any dust or anything on the paintbrush. Once you have a heavy and even layer of paint, what I'm going to do is basically the same as I did with the roller. I'm going to start at an edge and just let the weight of the paintbrush draw it through. Here's a close-up of how heavy I was able to get the paint on. Now just let it dry and put on other coats. Also, same as the roller, you could just put your paintbrush in a Ziploc baggie so it doesn't dry out. And here's the paint after dried on the first coat. This is the brushed appearance. it laid down very flat because the first layer was very, very heavy. For painting a panel door specifically, I would suggest using a combination of the brush and the roller. You could do the whole door with a brush, but it'd be very hard to do it with just a roller because you have to get into the panels. So for doing the panels, I would suggest getting the paintbrush, painting all around here like this, and then doing a finish pass in the panels like this, overlapping onto the flat parts. Then going back with the roller and just back rolling it on the flat parts only. That way there won't be big bunches of paint right here or here in the cracks of the panel. Now that the doors are painted, it's time to reinstall them. At this point, I would strongly suggest changing out the hardware, especially if they're old or the previous owner painted over them and they just look nasty. So to do this, I'm going to start out with replacing the hinges. So remove the existing hinge and keep track of how it's installed. So when you look at it, notice which orientation it is. It could either be like this or like this. It can only go one way just because of the geometry of it. You put it the wrong way, it won't fit correctly when you try to install the door. Tighten them down, but not all the way, in case you need to move it around slightly to get the door in. Do the same for the bottom hinge. Once the hinge is attached, I'm going to line the door up to it, just like this. Then I'm going to go around the other side. Now I'm just going to lift the door up very slightly. You could rest it on the tip of your shoe or something just so it lines up. Once you've hand tightened all of them, you can drill all of them in, but leave them loose. Now I'm just going to do the exact same thing to the bottom hinge. So now I'm going to fully tighten all of them, place the doorknob hardware. So I'm going to start with this plate right here on the frame. So now it's time to install the doorknob. If you have a slot already routed out right here, you would use your faceplate and it would be a direct replacement. Since I do not, I need to remove this faceplate. To do this, you just stick a screwdriver in here. So install the doorknob, get the outside. In this case, this would have a keyhole or it's just a little slot right here where a screwdriver can unlock it. This goes in from the outside. This square piece right here will line up with this square hole in here. This is a really tight fit. These pins need to be vertically aligned like this. Turn it, make sure everything works. These little holes need to be vertically aligned as well to match up with these holes right here. I'm having a little trouble on mine because this is such a tight fit that this top knob is actually rubbing directly on the wood. So this thickness of this plastic can't fit there. So what I'm going to do is remove this, and I'm just going to get a screwdriver and gouge it out so it fits. I'm going to do the same to the bottom just so I don't have to mess with it again. Okay, so round two, I lined it back up and it closes now. So all I need to do is put these screws in. To make this easier, you could push these screws all the way in while the other knob is pulled out. That way you'll have enough space to get a screwdriver in there. So I have them all the way recessed right now. Once you fully tighten down the screws, do another test fit. And now you are done.